Welcome back to part 2 of the Geopolitical Pickles 2022 Year in Review season finale. We hope that you've enjoyed the first part, but if you haven't already listened to that, we suggest that you go back and do that first. We pick up the conversation now talking about Southern Africa after just finishing talking about West Africa, and we carry on talking about the geopolitics of Asia, the cyber and space domains, as well as climate change. We hope you enjoy the episode and happy holidays. So, staying on the continent and looking more towards Southern Africa, the SADC region, I'd like to just touch on what's been happening in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. Mm-hmm. The armed forces of the Democratic Republic of Congo, called SADC, they have accused the M23 rebel group, which basically exists all through the east of the country, of carrying out massacres of civilians. And they've also, throughout the year, carried out a number of attacks on government troop positions and attacked bases, and they've caused tens of thousands of refugees and displaced peoples. What's important about this conflict is the DRC has actually accused Rwanda of aiding and supporting the military group and the massacre and M23 in general.
Yeah, actually, indeed, the M23 is a rebel group that originated in 2012 as a retaliation to what they saw as a discrimination of the Congolese Tutsi population, often are of Rwandan descent, and referred to as Rwandophones. The M23 occupied the eastern city of Goma in 2012, forcing the SADC to intervene.
The Southern African Development Community.
To intervene and broker a ceasefire that led the majority of the group taking shelter in friendly Uganda and Rwanda.
So yeah, Rwanda's long denied any associations with M23. They fear that it will actually negatively impact their ability to access aid money, which they've received so much of since the genocide which occurred. However, Human Rights Watch, for example, has backed up the DRC's claim and basically said, they have evidence that the Rwandan government and the Rwandan army has supplied troops and weapons to M23 rebel group. The reason why this might be done by Rwanda is to basically destabilize the central DRC government and use them as a proxy force to create an environment, maybe a black spot where the government can't control, and create an environment where they can exploit some of the natural resources, which is very interesting for what we'll talk about next.
Basically, there are two really important raw materials that are mined in the DRC. However, there are many raw materials that are mined in the DRC, but two important ones that we'll talk are cobalt. Cobalt reserves of the DRC account for 60%, around 60% of the world, and it's a really important material in creating your
batteries,
so phone
batteries,
smartphone,
Tesla car batteries,
exactly.
And the next generation of energy storage devices, all use big battery technology, which is heavily reliant on a large supply of cobalt. And as you say, cobalt has 60% of the world's reserves and is the largest producer of cobalt in the world.
And then there's another material which is called pyrochlore, which is basically a strategic material that once used in manufacturing, it allows you to make up nozzles of rockets. It allows you to make up the engines for satellites. So it's actually pretty important for the international world.
What's actually fascinating about pyrochlore and its raw material when it's processed, which is niobium, which I had never heard of before doing some research.
Being an engineer,
I never heard of this. This material, it is, first of all, it's only located in DRC and Malaysia. In the whole world, it's the only places where you can get any niobium. And so when it's used in these really high-end technology appliances, that makes it extremely valuable and strategically important. However, interestingly, there is a publication report recently which said that Congo has never officially exported any of this material, whereas its neighbors, Uganda and Rwanda, have. So that lends some sort of credence to the idea that this destabilization effort by those countries using a proxy force, because they can't use the government forces, but using the proxy force of M23 to destabilize the Congolese government and be able to extract this material and export it, they've been able to potentially loot this niobium, this highly valuable material, which is only found in 2 places in the world. So I think it's a very fascinating topic, which next year in season 2, I think we plan to have a few episodes on the strategic importance of different materials. And this is just like a little teaser to what those discussions could entail.
Yes, the geopolitics of materials.
The geopolitics of materials, yeah.
Yes, it's going to be an interesting. Stay tuned for that. And now we go a little bit northern from the DRC, and we go to the conflict in the Tigray, which is an Ethiopian region. Well, the conflict is long, but the Tigray, for the TPLF, for example, the Tigray People's Liberation Front, was the one ruling Ethiopia for some 30 years. However, now in the opposition, there's been many issues. This particular conflict that is happening right now started in November 3rd, and it ran until November 4th, 2022.
November 3rd, 2020.
November 3rd, 2020 till 4th November 2022. However, arguably is still in place. Basically, the Tigrayan People Liberation Front, the TPLF, ruled for 27 years before and then lost power in 2018 to the current president, Abiy Ahmed. And these tensions between the Tigrayan region and Addis Ababa grew throughout 2021, with Tigrayan rebels getting really close to the capital of Addis Ababa, claiming that the state had enforced basically a famine in the region.
But their military successes were significant. They actually took over huge areas of the state and managed to force the government back into the stronghold of the capital, Addis Ababa. So there was a real threat to the actual government.
You probably remember that last year.
Just a year ago.
Exactly.
And then since then, we didn't hear much of it. And the conflict sort of it was a bit of a stalemate. And then since then, the central government forces have been able to retake much of that land and fight back against the rebels. And that's led to the situation now where a peace treaty has been signed. And as part of that, there's a disarmament process. A ceasefire, sorry, not a peace treaty. But it's a ceasefire, and then there's on top of that a disarmament process, which lends a lot of hope to the fact that it will be a long-term thing. It's also got clauses in there for access for humanitarian aid, for instance, to the areas of Tigray, which you said were in famine. The one negative to the accords that have been held so far is that they didn't include neighboring Eritrea, of which Tigray was kind of in a two-way war and caught in the middle between Ethiopia and Eritrea. So it's yet to be seen if that will be a sticking point. But I think overall its prospects are quite good.
It is left to see whether the ceasefire though will last. If it lasts, probably we will have that. But however, this ceasefire was signed on November 4th and November 5th. Tigray region claimed that Ethiopia had actually launched strikes into the region. And Addis Ababa claimed the opposite for coming from Tigray. So hopefully the situation will get better, but it is still... The ceasefire is a good first step, but it is still left to see how will it develop in that sense.
I mean, Ethiopia is the home of the African Union. So it's a very geographically and geopolitically important center in Africa. So its stability is really actually important. I think it's the third largest economy in Africa. So its long-term stability is super important, and we'll see what 2023 holds. But I mean, in my opinion, I think that it's mostly a positive outlook. It's a much improved situation to this same time last year for Ethiopia.
And now we finish with Africa and we go with Asia. What is happening in Asia? Well, what's happening in Asia, what we have right now...
You have to start with the biggest...
We have to start with the...
biggest country in the world.
Well, no.
Oh, yeah, they lost that status?
By population, they lost that status. Well, by population, it's always still there, but apparently they will lose the status. However, we're going to talk about the largest or second largest economy in the world. However, you're going to measure it, which is China. And China during 2022 has undergone through a couple interesting things that we would like to point out. The first of it has been its COVID-0 policy and the repercussions that it's got in its own population. Just as a reminder, China was the location of the first confirmed case of COVID-19, and ever since they've imposed a really, really harsh COVID-0 policy with strict lockdown imposed by local authorities, mass testing, isolation at home, and sort of relating to that, pretty sure you've all seen the videos of how it works. These restrictions impacted the supply chains and big cities such as Shanghai, Tianjin, or Ningbo, and the lockdowns will remain until no infections are reported. That means that if there are 30 infections, 100 infections in a city of 10 million people, the entire city had to go to lockdown.
And
Exactly.
I mean, these restrictions continued on until the massive protests just in the last few weeks, which have seen the government reverse their policies of some of these COVID-0 measures. But this also had a massive impact on people's ability to earn money. It affected the supply chains. And it's been very interesting to see the situation develop, because if we look at China as a whole, they have protests localized across the country fairly regularly, but they're never focused against the central ruling Communist Party, the CCP, or Xi himself, because they have such a stronghold over their access to information and the security forces that it's not really a safe bet to actually criticize the government. And this was the first time we saw widespread protests against the CCP and Xi himself. And we saw a big state response to these protests. We saw them crack down on social media. We saw them crack down on the use of VPNs, which gave people access to external sites outside
which were
China.
already cracked down before.
Which were already cracked down before,
Yes.
but this was even harsher.
There's interesting how did they crash down these messages on Twitter, for example, or on Facebook?
Yeah, so we saw evidence that, for instance, as you say, that there was huge bot influx on platforms such as Twitter, where they would use any hashtag such as Shanghai or Beijing or hashtag China.
Or hashtag, I would like to point out, white paper or A4, because one of the things that were one of the
Icons
icons behind these demonstrations were white A4 papers
signifying
that they couldn't talk.
Exactly. And so any of these hashtags basically just got inundated with rubbish posts about pornography, gambling, nonsense information. You know, it was just like a flood of irrelevant information to try and control the narrative. And I think we do touch on technology later, but I think it's a very important area for geopolitics of the future. I mean, how social media can be used by governments to control a population and how they can crack down on
You don't even need to monitor. You need to overload it with other information in a way.
Different strategies that the government can use to combat.
Would you call it a DDoS attack on
it's different.
On a hashtag?
Maybe kind of a DDoS. It's the same basic principle.
Yeah. As for this was not the only thing that was happening in China. There are two matters that we're going to be talking about. Firstly, we want to talk a little bit about the economy. China has been growing below 5% this year, whereas it actually, according to the estimates, it only grew 3.9 year on year, whereas the target was to grow to 5.5. So their target of growth is really, really far, and this was one of Xi's main promises in that matter. Importantly, these changes this reduction of Chinese GDP increases the chances of global recession, and it makes the yuan more likely to have the worst year in decades, as it in relation with the US dollar.
And as you rightfully point out, the fact that it could potentially lead to some sort of global recession is because China is a hub for world markets. I mean, without Chinese economy, everything else sort of grinds to a halt. And I mean, it might not sound like much that the fact that they're only having 3.9% GDP growth compared to prediction of 5.5. But for China over the last 30 years, this is historically low, and it's seen a drop in living standard.
The lowest, if I'm not wrong.
I think it might be the historically lowest in the last 30 years, which has also led fuel to this internal discontent, which we've seen again for the first time in 30 years, the same period basically. So I think these two things are hand in hand. The COVID-0 policy meant that people were not able to go out and spend money, but also that they saw their livelihood and ability to earn money severely affected. And then downstream from that, the industrial construction, all these sort of industries were not able to produce the highest amount of goods and everything that were in previous years.
Yes, there are several things that touch into this economic situation in China. The demand from countries such as the United States, for example, has been reduced. It has decreased due to higher interest rates, with an economic war going right now between the United States and China. The Ukraine war and the inflation related to that. And, for example, the property market crisis, which is right now, there are mortgages, payment refusal, and finished construction and industries that used to contribute to the GDP, but right now they are not being that productive. And in that sense also we can include climate change striking China, where extreme weather is affecting industry sectors. For example, iPhone or Tesla makers had to literally shut down their factories.
Due to lack of electricity.
Due to
the rivers drying up, basically.
Exactly.
And the fact that they couldn't generate the hydroelectricity power that they need to power these factories.
Exactly, which is really, really interesting. And also something that has happened not just in China, but elsewhere in the world, which we will talk about it actually. The main tech business losing their investors. For example, one big example is Alibaba, which has dropped revenues. Alibaba was really known in other countries as AliExpress, for example. It's part of the Alibaba group, but it's dropped its revenue and it's lost more than 10,000 employees this last year.
I think the last point to talk about with China is the fact that they held their 5-year CCP Congress. And this was opportunity for Xi to stand for his third term of power. Their rules got changed so that he could remain in power for a third term. And so this is kind of a historic situation. During this position, he basically reinforced his own strategic strength within the party. And if we look at the actual outlook for China that came from this, he talks about Taiwan, wanting to take back Taiwan, the reunification being one of the key aspects of his next term in presidency.
Peaceful or unpeaceful?
Peaceful, or for the first time outwardly stating that he can't rule out the use of force or any other necessary measures to reintegrate Taiwan.
It is interesting because now we're seeing Xi Jinping trying to see the balance between that pragmatism and that ideology. And for example, in the case of with the One China policy over Taiwan and so on. But there are also, in regards with Taiwan, there are also some experts that are saying that nothing much has changed from the August 2022 Taiwan white paper. Basically, in this report was a very detailed list of number of goals that China wanted to achieve between 2027 and 2035. So for Taiwan, that is more or less it. However, there are other regions where China is involved in that sense. For example, we have the situation in the South China Sea, and it does not appear that China's South China Sea policies will change much after the new administration.
What we see is a continuation of how they've acted in the last, say, 3 years, 4 years, which is expansionist policies throughout the South China Sea. We're looking to be more forceful to their neighbors, basically dominate that space through the increase in
the newly created islands.
Newly created islands, also an increase in naval visibility of Chinese vessels within the South China Sea. So they are the dominant presence there. They're trying to say to the rest of the countries that have area near the South China Sea that China is the boss. This is their playground, and that includes to America because of Taiwan, Japan, South Korea, that allied bloc surrounding China in the South China Sea.
And now talking about China, well, let's talk a little bit about Taiwan because something happened there, and is that U.S. House Representative Nancy Pelosi visited Taiwan on August 2nd this year, which was the first formal visit of a U.S. officer since 1997 to the island.
I think, we're just talking about China's South China Sea policy of aggression, maybe of dominating that space. However, this is kind of a counter reaction to that, with America reaffirming, this is their own word, reaffirm America's unshakable commitment to our allies and friends in the region. I think if you see this as part of a larger regional push from America to create closer ties with Japan, South Korea, Australia through the AUKUS treaty, which we might have a bonus episode released about soon, these ties are part of a pushback against China's assertive South China Sea policies. This Taiwan visit is part of that whole situation where they're trying to put the focus back into Southeast Asia and
pivot to Asia.
A pivot to Asia, and I think because of this directly, it created a big pushback from China, with them outwardly being hostile towards the visit. They first condemned the visit and called it a provocation to the One China policy and said it's a threat to their territorial integrity.
Yep.
They responded with force.
They responded with military drills around Taiwan, even firing missiles to the eastern coast of Taiwan. There's a map here that shows you where is the eastern coast of Taiwan.
So if you remember back in August, these were large-scale naval and Air Force operations using live ammunition, live bombing exercises, live shelling exercises, all just off the coast and right on the edge of Taiwan's territorial waters. So this is a massive show of force by China as a direct response to this visit from Nancy Pelosi. And the US has reaffirmed commitment to Taiwan.
Yeah, so for 2023, we may see some increased tension or potential incidents within the South China Sea with regards to Taiwan.
Yeah, I mean,
because both great powers are looking at the island right now.
I think it's an interesting place to look for next year as a hotspot. So if we look at Taiwan and Chinese relations, and the potential there for an incident, in my opinion, is quite high. And then flowing really neatly on from that, if we stay in the region and say another area where there's really high possibility for maybe a miscalculation, but because of these increased tensions and hostilities, is North Korea.
Yes. Basically, the US, Japan, Republic of Korea trilateral partnership of the Indo-Pacific apparently triggered
angry response from
North
Pyongyang,
Korea.
yeah.
And the response was given in the shape of rocket launches.
They've launched long-range intercontinental ballistic missiles Japan.
Over Japan, even with apparently with nuclear capacity. So it's basically in a show-off of North Korea's capability to actually wage war or attack any of these territories as a response, and it's created a situation a little bit more unpredictable in the Korean Peninsula
because obviously North Korea is a nuclear power as well.
North Korea is a nuclear power, and we know that there is a demilitarized zone. There is no peace signed between the two Koreas, and all these matters. And obviously, to those rocket launches, there was a response from Washington, Tokyo, and Seoul, with the United States willing to defend South Korea and Japan with full range of capabilities, including nuclear weapons. As stated in the Cambodia summit, there's also been joint military drills between the three countries to maintain peace, stability, and defend the rule-based international order. I mean, from North Korea, you never know.
You never know. I think this is kind of the tensest it's been for a long time, like the Taiwan-China situation. And I think, again, it shows the world in 2023 might be quite an unstable place with a lot of these conflicts flaring up after they've kind of been dormant or stagnant for a long time, and maybe states more willing to wage war again in the shadow of the Russia-Ukraine war as well.
And following Asia, and just also to finish a little bit with it, we cannot forget about an island in South Asia, which is Sri Lanka.
Which I think a lot of people might have...
Which a lot of people might not have heard of it, but there's been something, or maybe they've seen the videos, because the videos were really...
But they were brief. I mean,
they were brief.
They went out of public attention. I think this was a really big news story earlier in the year that sort of faded away.
Basically, for you to understand it, what happened in Sri Lanka after COVID-19, the foreign debt of the country increased, causing an inflation of more than 55% and increasing. And unprecedented demonstrations took place in the country. Also, there were shortages of basic necessities of food and fuel. And these protests in March, blaming the government for the worst island crisis in the history, even managed to storm key government buildings, even the house of the prime minister, the president.
And the president ended up fleeing the country, basically.
President Rajapaksa.
And following this, Rajapaksa resigned as president. He fled for the Maldives. And the prime minister, Wickremesinghe, I don't know if I pronounced that correctly, but he declared a state of emergency.
Us for our pronunciation.
Sri Lankan names are very difficult, I think. But then he became president after declaring a state of emergency. So he was prime minister, he took over as president, and then Dinesh Gunawardena became prime minister. However, as soon as the spotlight sort of went away from Sri Lanka, the Rajapaksa family returned to the country and posed a new challenge to the security of the country. The Rajapaksa family have held power in Sri Lanka for
the last 2 decades.
For decades, and have very long reach and stronghold over government institutions.
But they've been basically accused of corrupting the country throughout these 2 decades. And the protesters actually said that in case of Rajapaksa coming back to power, they would go back to the streets. They were also in the middle of, among all these problems that they were already internally having throughout the year, they also saw themselves in the middle of the power competition between China and the United States, where they accepted one Chinese vessel to deck in Colombo, if I'm not wrong, in the port. And the United States told them that they couldn't accept the Chinese entering there, and the Chinese were, this is also like we can do if the government is accepting us, blah, blah, blah. So the Sri Lankan population suddenly saw itself, not just with the inflation that they had, with all the internal problems that they had with new government and so on, they also saw themselves in the middle of that power competition in the Indic Ocean between China and the United States.
Yeah. The failure and the collapse of the Sri Lankan government and the ensuing problems is basically a trilateral issue. I think we have the intersection between foreign aid and foreign investment from the West. We have Chinese direct investment through the Belt and Road Initiative. And then we've got poor governance and corruption from the government, making these three pillars, which in turn collapsed the economy and meant that they couldn't even import basic necessities such as fuel and medicine. And I don't know, the outlook for me for Sri Lanka for 2023 is still pretty bleak. I haven't seen a huge turnaround in the government. That's it.
I don't know if it will get better. But we're going to stay a little bit, and this is the last. However, I said before that one was the last because now we want to talk about something that affects geography and affects politics, and that's why we have it in geopolitics, which is climate change. And climate change this year, it's been identified in the COP27, which took place in Dar al-Sham in Egypt. But before talking about the convention, we would like to talk a little bit on the effects of climate change. And this year, I think they have to be put on the floods that have been happening in Pakistan.
Yeah, there's been effects of climate change felt all across the globe. And predominantly, it's the poorer nations that bear the brunt of the worst of climate change. But just to name a few incidents, we have huge severe flooding and storms in Miami in the United States. We had fires in Spain at the beginning of the year. And now the worst of all these natural disasters was the floods that happened in Pakistan. So these floods, truly awful natural disaster, which followed back-to-back heat waves in Pakistan, causing the glaciers in the Himalayas to actually melt and bring down huge quantities of water from the Himalayas. And then immediately following this, there was a record monsoon rainfall season, which led to extensive flooding and 33 million people, or 1 in 7 people in the whole country, being impacted, and most of those being displaced from their homes.
Now, according to the latest data, around 33 million people, or 1 in 7 people in Pakistan, have been impacted in one way or another. 1,700 people have already died. 1.2 million livestock heads have been killed. 7.5 million have been internally displaced. And still, an estimated 25% of the country is underwater, which is something incredible. The videos coming from Pakistan have been something incredible because critical infrastructure and facilities have been just damaged, causing issues in drinking water and cultivating food and having any kind of food throughout basically the entire country. Already, Pakistan is, as you were saying, one of the most vulnerable and also one of the least contributors to global greenhouse gases, with less than 1%.
Pakistan, as you say, is not a very big contributor to global greenhouse gases, but they bore the brunt of this natural disaster, and it's caused overestimated $30 billion worth of damage, which led to this being used as a push at COP27 to try and include for the first time a loss and damage fund against the rich nations which basically caused all the pollution over the industrialization period. So we look at all of Europe, America, Australia, all these industrialized nations which far outweigh their contribution to the greenhouse gas situation that we have now, compared to the much poorer nations, the developing nations, which don't have this history of burning fossil fuels, but are actually bearing the brunt of the current situation. And I think that's an interesting way to lead into COP27 and how that was used by, I think they were called the COP77, which was this grouping of 77 developing nations to push for the loss and damage fund, which was probably one of the biggest outcomes of COP27.
Yeah, there were two outcomes that were pursued by these developing nations. The first one was the one that you've just mentioned, and the second was they were trying to make the developed nations or the industrialized nations fund their transition to green energy, as their main concern right now for these developing nations is not climate change, rather than energy security, because it's a most immediate threat for them. However, the ending draft document, as you were mentioning, yes, it includes this mechanism for poorer nations to claim historical damage in that matter, but it does not mention any phase out of oil and gas and commits only to phase out unabated coal, leaving a lot of space for both countries and multinational institutions, multinational companies and so on, to keep on polluting. For this matter, one of the problems highlighted by the UN expert group report on COP27 was that greenwashing is a persistent problem.
Which is these big international corporations making their image seem to be a lot more green than it actually is. We see fossil fuel companies spend 99% of their budget on on promoting greenery, when they only spend, I think, 20% of their research and development on new green technologies, where they are amongst the biggest polluters in the world. So these companies are continuing to undertake greenwashing, and it's not just limited to petrochemical companies. It also includes all clothing brands.
Coca-Cola, if I'm not wrong, is the largest polluter in the world.
Quite possibly.
I think it is, yes.
I mean, it's a huge problem that's persisting, and COP27 doesn't give a huge case for optimism. It will if some of these poorer nations are given access to funds to fund a green transition, but considering that most of the developed nations are struggling to sell that to their own domestic markets, I think that the outlook for 2023 is not good. I think we'll see more of the same, and we'll end up in a situation like we were from last COP26, where we look and the same pledges are repeated. I remain pessimistic on the outlook, and unfortunately
in this matter, actually, I would like to highlight the recent wave of demonstrations or of direct actions related to climate change objectives that have taken place both in Europe and the United States. Criticized sometimes because of the way of doing it, but still the amount of direct actions, the people that are taking place in these direct actions, which are not just the youth, as it was in the previous years, massive groups of scientists pointing out the moment that we are right now and the need to actually address climate change properly and not through greenwashing. It is important, and that movement will probably keep on growing, and if not addressed properly, it will probably, now that I'm thinking about it, it will probably develop into a proper security threat in developed countries. So that is something that will live there. We'll see in 2023 how it goes. And now let's forget about the realms that we have, the geopolitical domains.
Physical, earthbound domains. But
let's go on to technology.
So I would say this is a cyber domain. And I mean, if we talk about greenwashing, I think we're going to touch briefly now on the rise and fall of crypto, the performance of tech industry, some of these huge investment places where we've seen huge money poured into and actually can be quite terrible for the environment as well. If we look at big tech corporations in general, 2022 was a very bad year.
It was terrible.
We saw them lose massive amounts of capital, including Meta, PayPal, Netflix. All of their stock market plummeted. Nvidia, because Twitter these days, Nvidia, because of the chip war that's being played out between Taiwan and US and China. It's all interconnected with the geopolitics of the regions there.
Yes. And for example, there's been massive layoffs from these technological companies. Amazon has announced firing 10,000 people, which represents 3% of its workforce. Meta has fired 11,000 people, which represents 13% of the workforce. Even Microsoft has fired 1,000 people.
And as you say, Twitter's fired 5,000 people.
Twitter's fired 5,000 people and lost, I don't know, like double digits of value. I think it's like 35%. The causes for the downturn of the tech market can be found on the high inflation and the high interest rates posed by the Fed. And this fall of tech stock prices has affected the cryptocurrency market massively this year, with a massive falls like Bitcoin falling from its highest ever in November 2021 to 75% less nowadays, which is incredible.
And maybe this is the beginning of the end for those cryptos. I mean, we've seen just recently the failure of some of the big crypto exchange, such as FTX, collapsing, as well as earlier in the year we saw a not as big market, but Terra Luna also collapsed. I mean, these places were kind of unregulated, existed outside the realm of government interaction. And we've seen now that there's a lot of risk, and that actually this may sort of put an end to that sort of deregulation and this playground where people were spending huge amounts of money and making a lot of money. There was just no ability for government oversight, which protects these markets around the world. We've seen, for instance, is it El Salvador, where they adopted Bitcoin as one of their official currencies, and now that's had huge ramifications. This drop in price of Bitcoin, 75%, means they've had huge losses, huge gaps in the government budget because of being closely tied with this cryptocurrency market.
One interesting thing that I want to touch upon FTX, as you were mentioning, is that both the co-CEOs were the second or one of the biggest donors of one of them from the Republican Party of the United States and the other one from the Democrat Party of the United States. Just to see more or less where these people were putting their money, in every side. We can go already onto space, I believe.
The fourth physical domain of the realm of geopolitics. So the first thing to talk about this year in space, what happened in 2022, was the DART mission, which was the first of its kind, which was basically NASA conducting what was called a double asteroid redirection test, DART, but was basically to test whether we could stop an asteroid from impacting on Earth. If there's one heading towards us, whether we on Earth had the capability. I mean, we've seen it in movies for a long time. We saw Jason Statham up there drilling on the asteroid. But in reality, this was science fiction until this year, that we can actually launch a craft on a asteroid and then blow it up or collide with it with enough force that it will direct it out of Earth's orbit. This was a huge success, I think, this mission.
The DART spacecraft was launched actually 2021, but this crash took place this year and weighed up to 600 kilograms. And the goal of the mission, as you rightfully mentioned, was to collide with the Dimorphos asteroid, which orbits around the Didymos asteroid located in the Apollo group of near-Earth asteroids. I understood everything until here. On the 11th October, NASA confirmed that it was a success. And even though it doesn't guarantee that the Earth would be protected in case of an asteroid clash or whatever, it is a first step into managing this planetary security.
Defense and security system.
Exactly.
And just on this space security situation, the second major development from a geopolitics level is the first ban or basically treaty signed by the United States on anti-satellite testing. They announced in April that they're not going to conduct any anti-satellite missile tests. We saw Russia actually undertake this in 2021, which causes huge amounts of space debris. Because of the huge speeds objects are hurtling around the Earth at when they're in orbit, even an object the size of a pea can cause devastating damage to our satellite infrastructure, to the International Space Station, and an impact like that in itself creates more debris. And yeah, exactly. It cascades down and becomes, and we could eventually get to a place where we couldn't actually launch shuttles into space anymore. So this, to me, is a huge step forward in basically codifying that they are not going to undertake these tests. So far, there's only been tests by the US, India, China, and Russia.
However, and even though the UN General Assembly voted on December 7 to not launch this anti-satellite testing, 9 countries voted no, and among those, you have abstaining India, Russia, China, and Iran saying no. So it is still left to see if this will actually be properly enforced. But it is, as you were mentioning, it is a dangerous situation.
I think the goal of this treaty by the United States is actually to create a precedent similar to the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, where it becomes such a big international taboo that no country really would do it anymore. And so I think it's a first step towards doing that. And as you see already, we've had 155 countries signing on. Most of those countries, admittedly, don't have the capabilities to launch an anti-satellite missile.
Really fast rockets into the...
and very precise. I mean, it's very technologically advanced, but just the fact that they're able to get, all the other nations to sign on, India abstaining, that's probably the next major geopolitical hurdle to try and get India on board, because India previously conducted these tests and caused huge amounts of debris, which will be up there for the next 3 decades. China's done the same. And as we said, Russia have already done it. So the first hurdle will be India, and then we look forward to these countries maybe signing on and creating a new age of space security and a shared utilization of space for the future. So I think that's a good place to leave it for 2022.
It's been a long 2022, huh?
It has. There's been a lot that's happened.
We started with full lockdown, everything, and now
we ended up with space satellites testing missiles flying. But I think it's been
a really long year. I don't know what am I gonna do.
But it's been a good year. As you said at the start, this has been the first year of the geopolitical pickle, and we really appreciate everyone that has been here with us, and anyone that continues to jump in the pickle jar, as you say. That's
It's our pickle jar. We just want to thank you all for your sustained support, for checking our videos, for checking our content. We hope that we're doing something that you like, that it's interesting for you.
It's entertaining, it's interesting, and
you're learning.
You learn something.
We're coming with more for 2023 because, as you see, the world is not stopping, so we cannot stop. So just to end, we would like to thank all the people that are making the geopolitical pickle possible, because we are the faces of these sometimes, but there's a lot of people working here with us.
Without their behind-the-scenes efforts, we wouldn't be able to bring you this high-quality content every week.
So thank you very much to Alex Perry, our executive producer. We want to thank Argumedo, Lía Rodríguez, Luca Spiller, Paula Gómez, and also our constant guests that we've got, Milos Dangubic, Federico Caprari,
for their research and
everything. Also want to thank Shelby Wickless for her support and
creative design tips
and wonderful meals. And I want to thank you, my wonderful co-host Ronan Wordsworth, for the first season of the Geopolitical Pickle. I hope you enjoyed as much as I did, and I hope people enjoyed as much as I did with you.
I did indeed, and we look forward to being back with you next year after Christmas and New Year. So wish everyone happy holiday season and all the best for next year.
Have a nice year, and see you again at the Geopolitical Pickle.